Hannibal's great achievement at Trasimene is the scale of the ambush which he pulls off. Ambushes are common in warfare between forces of a few dozen men. What Hannibal does is to conceal an army of several tens of thousands on a hillside and to enforce such discipline that they do not give their presence away by noise, by a premature attack, despite the nerves they must have felt. It's a great tribute to his own eye for ground and to the discipline which he can encourage in such an army.
The other thing Hannibal wanted to encourage was the disintegration of Rome's federation of Italian cities. Because it wasn't happening as fast as he expected, he gave orders that prisoners of war should be treated leniently, as long as they weren't Roman.
We are told that he released his Italian and Latin allies, telling them to go home and tell their fellow countrymen that he had not come to Italy to fight them, he'd come to fight Rome on their behalf. And this suggests that the linchpin of his strategy was to try to win over Rome's allies to his side, in effect to fight Rome with her own strength.
Archaeology has revealed what may be another interesting insight into this strategy. Trasimene is on Etruscan land. There are signs that after the battle, the Carthaginians went to great lengths to make the site safe for local people. In the 1950s, a series of ditches cut into the landscape were discovered. This one has been restored to its original condition. Archaeologists believe these ovens were part of a system that Hannibal devised for burning the thousands of corpses, which would have caused epidemics if left to rot.
These are some of the cremation ovens. They're of a truncated cone or ovoid shape, 5 or 6 meters deep, with a diameter of 4 or 5 meters. According to the archaeologist Susini, they were used for burning the bodies of soldiers who'd fallen in battle. The Carthaginians used a simple method. They would lay tree trunks and branches across the top and put the corpses over them. Then fires would be lit in the pits underneath. The heat and the flames would consume the bodies, and then the ash would collapse into the bottom. Then the whole process was repeated again and again.
For Rome itself, there was no comfort. News of so many deaths and yet another defeat caused utter chaos. The population fell into a state of abject depression. Livy says that when the stragglers returned, mothers and wives dropped dead on the spot at the sight of their kinsmen whom they'd given up for dead. They did not know there was worse to come. Hannibal's main problem by now was feeding his army. There were farms to raid and crops to steal, but despite his victories, Rome's allies were not all defecting to his side. And he now faced an unexpected development. An enemy that was scorching its own earth. It was the strategy of Quintus Fabius Maximus, who was now in charge of the Roman war effort. His plan was to fight a guerrilla war, harrying Hannibal without engaging him in a large battle. By burning the countryside and leaving no crops for Hannibal to steal, Fabius wanted to starve the Carthaginians into giving up. The strategy worked, but for the Romans, it was success of the wrong kind.
Roman honor and glory depended upon fighting, upon winning battles. Fabius' tactic of delaying, of destroying land so that Hannibal didn't have food to live off, of holding back, shadowing him rather than fighting him, must have appeared extraordinarily strange, as though suddenly we were to say, no, we won't enter this World Cup, our team will be better in 4 years' time. It would be unheard of. We must go and fight. And so it wasn't just the aristocrats in Rome. It was that everyone must have carped and sneered and said, you're a coward, you must fight. That's the Roman tradition.
So they nicknamed Fabius the Delayer and let Hannibal off the hook.
The Romans are their own worst enemies. They are very uncomfortable with this Fabian strategy of delay, especially because it means their own farmlands being ruined by Hannibal while they stand back and do nothing. Therefore, after a few months, new consuls come into power who decide that the best way to tackle Hannibal is through traditional Roman means, amassing a vast army in an open field and crushing him.
Early in the summer of 216 BC, the food situation was getting desperate for the Carthaginians. Hannibal's solution was to come here, to a Roman army grain store at Cannae in the far south of Italy. Hannibal captured this fortified town, restocked his supplies, and prepared to meet his enemy face to face on the open battlefield. On learning that the Carthaginians had captured the Cannae supply depot, the newly elected Roman consuls led two massive armies to annihilate Hannibal once and for all. Their force consisted of 86,000 men. Hannibal had 50,000. But the Romans still didn't understand what they were up against.
The Roman army was still fighting in a very archaic way, relying on the strength of the group, while Hannibal, who came from a very different background, had Alexander the Great as his role model. Hannibal fought using a combined force of cavalry and infantry, with one force supporting the other. These tactics were totally incomprehensible to the Romans.
The Romans were confident that in the open battlefield they would prevail by sheer weight of numbers, but once again, Hannibal used the terrain to help him. He set up his camp with his back towards the wind known today as the Lebecchio, so that the Romans would receive its dust-laden gusts full in the face. He then put his master plan into action.
Perhaps the most amazing part of Hannibal's achievement at Cannae is that his encirclement occurs not with a larger army than the Romans had, but with an army only about half their size.
It's a battle that has gone down in the annals of military history, still studied by budding generals today. Cannae was Hannibal's masterpiece. As the two armies lined up, the Roman plan was simple: to use their superior infantry numbers to punch through the much weaker Carthaginian line. But Hannibal had cleverly placed a screen of slingers and javelin throwers in front of his infantry, and they won the first blood of the day when the Roman consul Aemilius Paulus was severely wounded by a missile hurled from a slinger. The skirmishing had another function: to obscure the layout of Hannibal's forces from the Romans. It put his tough Gallic foot soldiers in the center to take the brunt of the attack, but held his crack African infantry slightly further back on each flank. Near the hills were his Numidian cavalry, up against a more or less equal force of Roman light cavalry. Near the river were his heavy cavalry of Spaniards and Gauls. They outnumbered the Roman heavy cavalry 3-1. Hannibal's plan was to draw the Roman attack towards the shallow crescent of Gauls at the center of his line, so as the armies closed, the African infantry on each flank held back slightly. The brunt of the Roman advance was taken by the Gauls in the center, just where Hannibal wanted it. Over near the hills, it was stalemate. The light cavalry squadrons were evenly matched. But down by the river, the Roman cavalry was in desperate straits. It was a bitter fight, but the numbers opposing them were simply too great. They were pushed back along the riverbank, and finally they turned and were routed. At this point came the most convincing evidence of Hannibal's uncanny ability to exert iron discipline in the heat of battle. Rather than pursuing the fleeing Roman cavalry, the Carthaginian cavalry turned across the battlefield towards the other flank. In the main infantry battle, the Romans in the center appeared to be winning. Hannibal's crescent formation flattened out as more and more Romans were drawn towards the weak spot in his front line. But on the flank nearest the hills, the Roman light cavalry saw the Carthaginian heavy cavalry coming across towards them. Fearing that they would be trapped, they turned and fled. The Numidians followed them to make sure there was no rally. But Hannibal's plan was working. As more and more Romans drove towards where they thought the breakthrough would come, the field cleared in front of the Carthaginian heavy infantry on the flanks. Suddenly, the Romans were being encircled. They found themselves being assailed from 3 sides at once, bunched together with no room to swing their swords. Not only that, but Hannibal's heavy cavalry now turned and attacked the rear of the Roman infantry. The Romans were now being attacked from all sides. They were still numerically stronger, but they were caught in a vice, and the battle became a massacre. $55,000 Romans were slaughtered, with men dying faster than in the Battle of the Somme. The ancient historian Polybius describes in graphic detail the fate of the Roman army.
As the outer ranks continued to fall, the rest were gradually huddled in and surrounded. They finally all were killed where they stood. While this murderous combat was going on, the Numidians, following up the fleeing cavalry, killed most of them and unseated the rest. Polybius, the Histories.
On that day, around 60,000 Romans perished. Both consuls died, as did all the officers. And so it was. An entire generation fell on the battlefield at Cannae.
This small memorial is all that commemorates one of the greatest battles of all time.